All right, my name is Matthew Monk. I'm here for the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History. Today is Saturday, June the 30th, 2018. If you could, please both state your names for the camera.
I am Melinda Zonger, and I'm the director and curator of the National Museum of the American Coverlet.
And I'm Laszlo Zonger, and I'm one of the founders of this museum.
All right. So what is a coverlet?
In the sense that we consider the word coverlet, it is a woven, decorative and utilitarian bed cover. We focus on the ones from the 19th century, which of course is the 1800s. Coverlets in our collection range in date from 1771, which is a geometric, to a figured and fancy that's dated 1889. They were made somewhat after that, but that's the period that we're interested in.
To me, a coverlet is sacred because it's the incoming settler's desire to have a pretty top piece on his bed weaves a beautiful American work of art, country art.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No data, no statistics, no technicalities. Weaver weaves a beautiful bed cover.
And they were made by both men and women very often in something of a vacuum. You know, a lot of these guys and women were working in pretty tough circumstances, obviously before central heat and electric light. And some of these folks were out in the middle of nowhere producing all this beautiful coverlet, colorful stuff. And we, as he said, we kind of think they're sacred. So that's our passion.
How did you first, what are each of your first experiences with a woven coverlet?
How much time do you have?
No.
It's a long answer. No, it was really, I think, I don't know about you, but I was into antiques in general, and discovered coverlets as part of my adventure into learning more about antiques. And I fell in love with a blue and white overshot, which I wanted desperately. And by the time I decided I just had to have it, it had been sold. And I was heartbroken, and I decided that the next one I saw was going to have a different outcome. And in the meantime, then I discovered figured and fancy ones, and that you could, learn more about who made them. And then I started getting deeper and deeper into the subject and learned how to weave, and it was sort of downhill from there. But it was probably an accidental discovery, but there was just something about it that just, works. It makes your heart sing. And I think once you're bitten, as we all know, those of us who are doing this, once you're bitten, then it's forever.
My story is a much sadder story. I used to be an antique dealer. I used to go to an auction house outside of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, a Conestoga auction house, and I bought a coverlet. I didn't know what it was. It was beautiful. And going to California, I lost it off the top of my car. Every single time, every time I see a red and white double woven coverlet, it's the one I lost.
It was in a box. You better specify that. It's not like you just laced it to the top of the...
No, I didn't cover the coverlet.
Yeah, I guess that's the story.
But it got lost somewhere in Texas.
Tell me a little bit about the transition and your role in promoting the coverlet as dealers, and then the transition as sort of the premier coverlet antiques dealers to the premier and really only museum that's dedicated solely to the American coverlet.
Well, for me, I was, as I was saying, I was living with antiques and collecting in general, living with furniture and the whole. It's a lifestyle, obviously. For about 15 years, and friends started to say, well, gee, I was haunting all the antique shows in the area, and everybody said, you should do this, you'd be good at it. And I don't know about that. I love it too much. What if it doesn't work? I don't know what I would do. It would break my heart. And then finally one day I thought, you know what, I will do this, but I will specialize in coverlets because I didn't see anybody else doing it, which automatically meant that it was not going to be easy because this was in New England and nobody knew what they were. But I thought, well, that's one thing I can talk about because, as a collector, it's one thing to buy something because you like it. You don't have to know what you're doing. You just buy something because you like it. If you know something about it, that's even better. But, when you're putting yourself in the position of talking about something, advising people, whatever, answering questions, then you better know what you're doing. So I thought, well, that's something I know a little bit about, and I can do this, and that'll be fun, and it'll give me an excuse to go out and find even more, and isn't that cool? So that was how that all started, and of course that's also how I met this character, because on my second trip out, looking for things for inventory, if you will, as opposed to keeping them, I met this guy, and we sort of got together. He likes to tell people that he sold me a bunch of coverlets and didn't want to be out of them, so he married the girl. But see, I beat you to it.
It is a fact.
But then we did that for about 15, 20, oh gosh, for a long time, I guess, a whole lot of years. And we sort of became better and better known as, we were really more crusaders than we were merchants, because so many people, even in high-end antique shows, would come in and wouldn't know what they were, and that's what they saw in our booth. We had lots and lots of them, and so we wound up answering questions and doing all this sort of thing, and we were working on, in addition to that, as you can imagine, helping people build some pretty nice collections, some of which ended badly, or at least ended in ways that we thought were safe that turned out they weren't, and it became very frustrating because we found that we were finding all this fabulous stuff, and it wasn't going, we thought they were going to safe locations. And we realized that we needed to do something that would bring it to a wider audience, and at the same time have some control over what happened to them. And so one day he just said, we need to start a museum, because that way we can preserve these things as well as show them. And my first reaction, to be honest with you, was, oh my God, no, that's a big response, that's a big deal. But at the same time, I thought, you know what, he's right, because somebody has to do this. And so, one thing led to another, and that's, of course, now we're a nonprofit. We have an absolutely fabulous board of directors. We've had a wonderful opportunity to meet fabulous people, even more than we already knew. So our activities are really based on not only showing these things, but helping people, encouraging people to learn more about them, because we think they're worth it. And we firmly believe in the importance of these things in the history of material culture here. And since relatively few people know what they are, I think it's very important that we get the word out. So that's a long answer to a short question, but there you go.
It sort of covers. But basically, the core of the whole thing is ignorance of coverlets by the general public. Our experience in the antiques business was day and night, people handling these without having any idea what they are. They are saying the most ridiculous things about the things they are selling. And the idea was, try to fix this, try to spread the news, try to give information, at least sort of bump them in the right direction. Coverlets are not quilts, number one. Coverlets are woven, number two. Coverlets are made in this country, made by everybody who came here. Basic things to know that makes the coverlet a significant piece of American textile art. Coverlet College, which the museum does yearly, was on the basis of this intent. Initially, we wanted to bring in antique dealers who handle coverlets and they don't know what they are selling, to educate them. Eventually, that grew into, in general, people know and learn more about coverlets.
Well, and it was to pick up on where he's talking, here we were in the business, and we were repeatedly seeing really wonderful coverlets in really great booths full of wonderful antiques, but they'd be misidentified in ways that are really basic to anybody who knows coverlets. And double weave being identified as summer and winter and all this kind of stuff. And it was the kind of thing that you can't get away with furniture in China, which is better understood. And some of these things, as I said, are really, really basic facts. And so it just made us even that much more crazy that there's so much misunderstanding out there. I hate to use the word ignorance, or if I use it, you can't blame somebody for not knowing something they've never been exposed to. that's fine, but it's our job to expose them to it if at all possible, and at least try to. We're swimming upstream with all this, but trying to help straighten out some of the really most common misunderstandings about all this. The question of the figured and fancy stuff being machine woven. Well, machine is a term that we have to understand and explore more fully. The fact that they were made by both men and women, and all this kind of stuff, and so many really basic things that are not that hard to get into your head once somebody explains it to you. And the typical response we get from people who go through here when they come out, he'll joke with them or we talk with them, and you'll say, well, are we still friends? What do you like? Do you think this is pretty cool? And they'll say, I never knew. That was great. Wow. And that's what we want to hear. We want to hear them say that they never knew and now they do, and it's really cool. And that's all we want to hear.
Right, so we'll take care of some basics next.
Okay.
Pretty easy question, but long. What are the different types of coverlets and the structures? And if you could explain in sort of lay terms, which I know has become sort of your full-time job now, explain in layman's terms to non-weavers what the different structures of coverlets are and what are some telltale signs of identification.
If you were building sort of a family tree, you would start out with the two main types that we consider to be the two main types, which are the geometrics and the figured and fancy. A geometric coverlet is a coverlet where the pattern, we're talking about pattern motifs now, based on circles and squares, exclusively circles and squares. You might see variations on that. And then you have the other type, which we refer to as figured and fancy. Those are the ones that have recognizable motifs, animals, buildings, flowers, inscriptions, things that you can look at and go, oh, I know what that is. They're made differently. They're made by different people, different segments of society, if you will. There is some overlap there. There is some overlap in terms of dates, but a lot of it is determined by your local geography, your local economy, whether or not your local economy will support the manufacture. Manufacture comes from handmade, not manufactured like we think of today. Because the figured and fancy coverlets were inherently more expensive, the equipment that made them was more elaborate. So if you were sitting on a mountaintop in Appalachia and Dad was killed by a bear last year and you have 13 kids, you're not going out and having a figured coverlet made for you. You are going to weave an overshot coverlet for yourself. So I use the word overshot. So we have figured and fancy, or geometric and figured and fancy. Then under that you have weave structure, which is the way the yarns are I don't want to say interwoven, but interleaved to create those patterns. The method that you use, and those would be overshot or float work, which is generally a geometric. You have double weave, which is two distinct layers that are connected in certain places but not tied. Those are made in either geometric or figured and fancy. Then you have summer and winter, which is a weave structure, not a look. And those can be made in geometric or figured patterns. And then you have tied biter bond or true biter bond, which is a Germanic influence that has a very strong, tends to, not always, but tends to have a very strong a vertical characteristic. And as always, these things are much easier to show somebody than they are to describe in a vacuum. But we have a room at this point that we have set up specifically to show people the different structures so that when they look at something, they can say, okay, I get it. And it's all a matter of training your eyes. With a little bit of experience, it's not that hard to differentiate. And it's just one more thing that when somebody gets it, oh, cool, I get it, I can go on, but
my approach is a little different. When I get a visitor, and I handle most of the visitors, I start with a coverlet is a woven piece of textile using cotton and wool, mostly. Then comes the next remark. Favorite word of coverlet science is mostly. Yeah, everything is an exception. But it's usually cotton and wool. Coverlets are usually, mostly woven in two halves, sewn together. Otherwise, the seam is not a repair. That's the way it's done. Coverlets are always reversible. Whether it's geometric or figured or fancy, coverlets are always reversible. always opposite in color. That's the basic. Then comes what Melinda was talking about, different structures, different methods. Nationalities will have differences in ways of weaving, in designing. After all, coverlets are designed by people usually who come here from another place. They bring their design sense, with memory with them, and it shows up in their work. There are typically German coverlets, there are typically Scottish. Appalachian coverlets are very different from the German elsewhere. So these are the things you give to people who absolutely have no idea. They come in, they see this, now they understand what they're looking at.
Well, what's fun about it is we encourage people to ask questions. And you really have to word your answers very carefully, because sometimes the semantics, sometimes the language that you use can inadvertently create a wrong impression. But we always tell somebody, at least I very often tell people, that no matter what the question is, the first two words of the answer are "it depends." Because the only absolute in coverlets is that there is no absolute. You will find an exception to every single thing you ever tell anybody. So I always tell them, take my answer with caution, because the next thing you see after you leave here, when you see another coverlet, it'll fly in the face of everything I told you, and that's just the way it is. But that's what keeps it interesting, because this is a bloodless hunt. We have seen thousands of coverlets at this point, and we are always seeing something new. And it's a very exciting thing. And of course, as you can imagine, the more you know, the more you realize how much you don't know. And so we get off on the smallest details sometimes, but it's really wonderful to see what they did with this stuff, considering the fact that all they needed was to stay warm. All they wanted was something that would be warm to cover their bed. They didn't have to make it beautiful, and that's what makes these people so fantastic in my mind, is that they created all this glorious stuff, none of which was really necessary, but
Under
boy doesn't it enhance
circumstances.
your life, and it's just, we did an exhibition which was my heart a couple of years ago, and it was a Noah's Ark. And we called it Lions and Tigers, No Bears, Oh My, because we'd never seen a bear in a coverlet. But we had 100 coverlets on display, all of which had animals in them, some of which were tiny, tiny, some of which were very big. Not just dogs and cats, but African animals and domestic animals and all kinds of critters. And of course, since I love animals, that doesn't get any better than that. That's a combination that you can't beat. But you never know what you're going to see next. And that's what's so cool. And the fact that we've done, there's so much research on these weavers, it helps you to understand history in general. It helps you to understand where we all came from. It helps us to appreciate the clothes we're wearing, because without weaving, we would all be embarrassed. It's a big part of our history. Don't forget, we were created as colonies. We weren't supposed to produce finished goods. So when people started producing finished goods, it was a big deal. And as we always like to say, when Washington was sworn in as president and he was wearing an American-made suit, it was a big deal. So it goes all the way back to that. So another aspect. It's a long answer again, but
it's an interesting idea. Why does an Ohio coverlet weaver put an alligator in his coverlet?
It's cool.
Why does an Indiana coverlet weaver put pagodas in his coverlet?
And there are reasons.
Yep, there is always a reason.
So tell me a little bit about the different places that professional weavers would have come from in Europe. Where are the weaving centers where are these weavers, these professional weavers, especially the figured and fancy folk? Where in Europe are they coming from?
Well, both the geometric, a lot of the southern Appalachian areas too were the figured and fancy coverlets came from Britain, primarily England and Scotland, Germany. There were Dutch, there were French Huguenots. I'm probably forgetting somebody, but even in the southern Appalachians where they were doing the geometrics, a lot of those folks were of Scottish descent. You would know that. All of this, but never mind, are of Scottish descent. So here again, unless you're Native American, you came from somewhere. But you don't see, things you don't see. I don't see Italian. I don't see, certain other
the one
groups.
thing we have to add to it is the strange island of Wisconsin and Minnesota.
Well, and
Where the
that tends to be
Scandinavians go.
Scandinavian, indeed.
And they're sticking with geometric
And indeed.
coverlets. They
But
don't
I
do-
think, it's in New England, which was settled or the earliest. We were just talking about this, the two of us, a few minutes ago. That the Brits tended to come in and sort of lead the way. And when things were a little more comfortable, the Germans came in. The Germans, they were smart folks. They weren't traveling out to the west unless the road was paid for. I'm not literally, but you get my drift. And so you have all kinds of. It's not just color and pattern. It's a whole different sensibility and lifestyle, and you see that reflected in architecture and everything else. But the Brits kind of paved the way, and the Dutch. And of course, when they came in, they settled in places that tended to look like home, either geographically or maybe even economically, or where they already knew somebody. In some cases, English wasn't their first language, so they settled in a place where somebody already spoke German or whatever, where they already knew somebody. They intermarried and all this, so you wind up with these little enclaves of people from a certain area, and that's how we get regional characteristics, just like you do in furniture and all the rest of it. So it gets to the point where, and here I'm digressing as I always do, but anyway, you get to the point where you can look at a coverlet and get a pretty good idea of what the background of that weaver was based on color and structure and everything else, but also where he might have come from, where he might have settled here.
When you wake up a Scottish weaver, all of a sudden a thistle shows up.
Yeah, yeah.
So what are some of those regional characteristics that you mentioned? What are the major coverlet weaving regions, and what are some visual or even structural sort of characteristics of those regions?
New York and New Jersey are really big on double weave. That's the Dutch and British. They tend to be monochromatic in color. Here again, there are exceptions to every rule, and we know of plenty of them. But they tend to be monochromatic, either blue and white, red and white, that kind of thing. Tend to be more open in their design work sometimes. The German stuff tends to be tied Beiderwand, tends to be multicolored, and of course with the tied Beiderwand, the color is going in from the side. With double weave, the color can go in both directions. So if you do introduce color, it can be really interesting when the two colors cross, which is one of the reasons why we really kind of like double weave a whole lot. But there are certain tendencies that they shied away from too. To see a blue and white coverlet in New York, that's the way it is. I mean, that's your standard. To see a blue and white tied Beiderwand coverlet from Pennsylvania, not so much. It was almost against the religion to make just blue and white. It had to be four colors. And those four colors very seldom had anything to do with the pattern that you see in the coverlet. We've had coverlet where the color is so overwhelming that you can't make out the pattern. When we were in the business, we had a coverlet that I was very happy to sell. I was very happy to buy it because it was interesting, but I was very happy to sell it because it had eagles along the bottom, and the eagles' bodies were blue and their heads were blood red. And it was very disturbing, and I would never have changed the color there. But they went just so far, and they had to change the color because somebody rang a bell, and they had to change the color. That's German. Having said that, some of these guys wove both because the tied Beiderwand was less expensive, required less material, so it wasn't unusual for some folks to do both. But generally speaking, you're going to see Pennsylvania, Ohio will be a German influence. And then as they move west, they start to blend. And Indiana, you see a lot of Scots doing double weave, but it's more colorful. So, yeah.
Most coverlets are Pennsylvania, Ohio, New York, less and less as you go west.
Figured and fancy, that is, yeah.
Producing coverlets for a price, you need a customer. If the population isn't there yet, there's no point in signing up. The interesting fact is, and it's an economic concern, the South does not produce jacquard coverlets or figured or fancy coverlets. The South stays with geometrics. So is New England. We don't have figured or fancy coverlets from Vermont, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Maine. It's geometric. Other conditions, climate, economic conditions, farming. How good is farming? Maryland, a very interesting example of southern Maryland. Southern Maryland, unfortunately, produced tobacco and destroyed the soil. So There is no customer, no rich farmer to buy a coverlet. Coverlets, figured or fancy coverlets from Maryland, is a very small territory, basically between Westminster and Hagerstown, where the rich German farms are. So, how much money the customer has will decide whether we're going to get a coverlet. Getting a coverlet is usually an important family occasion, birth, wedding, anniversary. I'm jokingly tell people, I ask people, do you know farmers? Yes, you know farmers. A coverlet is about the price of 4 acres of land in its day. Obviously, a rich farmer rather has 4 acres of land than a coverlet, but he has a wife who wants one. And it's the important family occasions that warrant ordering a coverlet. Coverlet is an investment, even in its day.
How much does a coverlet cost? You talked about that a little bit. How much does the average figured and fancy coverlet cost, and how does that cost shift across the 19th
Well,
century?
yeah, I was going to say, indeed it does shift, because it really depends on when and where.
Sure.
We were even discussing this earlier, that a coverlet could range in price from $2.75 all the way up to maybe $10. Harry Tyler sold some of his coverlets for $2.75 in New York State.
Latourette?
Yeah, Sarah
Good
Latourette. The
choice.
name escaped me for a moment. Sarah Latourette could weave a double weave coverlet with a center seam. So you're weaving that length 4 times really in one day, and she charged $10. Her regular production time would be 2 days, and it would be $5. That's been pretty well documented, actually. And to me, as a weaver, I can't even fathom that. But that's what these people were machines. These were the machines, So here again, that's a big disparity between the two. And you would think, well, Harry Tyler must have been a lot earlier. Well, not necessarily. He had a long career. He worked over 20 years, and a 20-year period, and 20 plus years, and he was working at pretty much the same time that she was. But she was in Indiana. He was in New York. So yeah, it really depended, and we talk a lot about figured and fancy coverlets, but think of the woman who's making the overshot coverlet for herself. She is taking it from the animal or the plant all the way through to the finished piece, which he has not. If he's a professional weaver, he's not doing all that part. So she's investing a year of her time, and there's a very famous, and I'm sure you know about this, question of President Frost of Berea asking this woman how long does it take to produce a coverlet, and she has an answer that is a paragraph long, and I wish I could quote it from memory because it's fabulous, but she winds up saying nigh unto a year, Mr. President. That's a big investment too. It may not be cash, but it's a big investment, especially when here we are talking about a difference in the division of labor. Obviously he has to crank these suckers out because he's feeding his family that way, but she's taking care of 13 kids in the fireplace. So it wasn't like she had nothing else to do either. So there's a big investment either way.
The disparity between $2.50 and $10 is many.
Yeah, that's
a
big lot of money.
For example, who provides the wool? If you have yarn prepared for you and provided by the customer, obviously the price goes down. If you have to do everything.
And there were separate charges for fringe and the name and all the different stuff. It depended on how much that weaver had to do. It was all a la carte.
When we are talking about a coverlet, woven coverlet, to somebody who comes into the museum fresh out of a cold, the explanation is very simple. Weaving is easy. The preparation makes the day. It starts with, and famous Miss So-and-so in the Appalachia, it depends on how healthy your sheep are. And how does the cotton come in? And when it's spun, then it's dyed. When it's dyed, the weaver has to have a loom that's prepared, thread the loom, which we call dressing the loom. Then comes weaving at the very end of this. The preparation is what makes the day.
Yeah, but don't say weaving is easy. That creates another. That's a
Weaving-
little dangerous to say
Well,
because you
it's
still
not
have to know what
easy.
you're doing.
It's-
You better be very darn consistent about the way you put in your fill and the way you beat and all this kind of stuff.
Well,
But
certainly. Weaving
it's
is-
a skilled process from start to finish, and we all know that. But yeah, there are various levels of
And we are not
investment and
even
cost.
talking about the figurative fancy coverlet, where we are talking about a couple of thousands of punched cards that has
So
to
let's-
come from somewhere.
Well, let's talk technology. So, what are the different pattern devices or shedding devices that these weavers would use, from overshot through the really fancy, through all the way to power looms? So what are the different kinds of looms and technological advancements that happen from, I guess, 1790 through 1870 or so that really help advance the creation and development of the American coverlet?
This is the nitty-naughty question.
Well, I mean, you know,
You do that.
your basic loom is a shaft loom. You know, you can start with 2 shafts, but of course, all you can do is weave plain weave. Technically, if you have 3 shafts, you can start to do pattern, but almost nobody does that. But once you have 4 shafts on your loom at home, and now hobbyists can tell you this all the time, you know, you can start weaving overshot. And you can weave summer and winter, or you can weave double weave. But for technical reasons, you start getting into that. Your pattern choices are very, very limited for those 2 structures, because I don't know how technical I should get, but you know, you need 2 shafts for every pattern block, so you can't do much. And this leads to another misunderstanding that we were constantly trying to correct with people, is that people assume that if it's geometric, then a woman made it, and if it's figured and fancy, then a man made it. Well, not so much, because first of all, overshot coverlets were being made long before the jacquard mechanism and all this other stuff was being introduced. So there were male weavers doing that too, because there was always a need for that, and not everybody had a loom in their house, and all those logical things that, if you think about it, it makes sense. But the minute you get into double weave geometric, that's probably going to be more like the realm of a professional weaver, which is more likely to be a man, not because she couldn't do it, but because she wouldn't have access to a multi-shaft loom. And many of these double weave geometrics are 20, 22, 24 shafts. You know, your home weaver sitting on a farm and with all these kids and everything, she's not doing that stuff. She's not going there. So that's going to be more likely in the realm of a professional too. For some reason we find, and I don't know how true this is or not, but we seem to find that summer and winter seems to be in the realm of professionals too, but you don't see it. I see it more in New England than elsewhere, and I have to research that more to find out what that's all about. But they tend to really, the overwhelming majority of them are blue and white, so when you see one in color, that's pretty exciting. We have a few that we are very happy about. But then, of course, you know, by the time you get into the figured and fancy, then you're dealing with mostly jacquard looms, but there are also barrel looms, and there are all these other things that we've talked about in all of our conversations.
And
so
the draw
they're
loom
well, but the question of whether or not they use draw looms to do figured and fancy, I mean, you know, there's all this kind of stuff. But there were a myriad of different types of looms that could weave figured and fancy coverlets, or could weave realistic curvilinear patterns. Let's put it that way. Whether or not they were all used for coverlet manufacture is another question. But those were usually in the realm of the male professional, simply because women always worked, but they didn't get paid. Men were professionals. They were in the guilds in Europe and not so much over here, but you know, men were predominantly the professionals. There were some female professionals too, and there are some well-documented and celebrated women who were working with jacquard mechanisms, but it was mostly because they were in a family that was already exposed to weaving, that was doing this. So in other words, they had access to the equipment. It wasn't a question of whether or not they were capable, but they had access to that equipment, which they wouldn't have been able to purchase on their own. So here's another long answer to a short question, but a lot of it was the mores of the day in terms of who could own what, and what the family economics were, and what the exposure was, and what your training opportunities were, and all that kind of stuff. But that's generally the way we think of that.
Women wove figured and fancy coverlets, even the ones who are not recognized, identified.
Yeah, some of them were working in the
I always
background and
tell
just weren't
people,
credited with this, you know.
Consider the time period. Conditions were incredibly difficult. Inhaling lint brown lung disease. Weavers were not long-lived, except for a few. And the woman would take over. When the guy is drunk, lots of drinking in those days. Whiskey was not just entertainment, but stay alive material. When they were drunk, the woman was out there producing, especially when they had to pay for the equipment.
Yeah, we have a few cases where, you know, he passed and she could continue the business.
Inherited
Either that or
changed.
she married the apprentice who was living in the house who was weaving with him or whatever. There are some of these stories are a little more hinky than others, but it makes for good storytelling. But yeah, it wasn't like the women couldn't do this in many cases, but they just didn't get the credit for it. But this is true of men too. You know, these apprentices who were working for somebody, weaving in their weaving products that had their boss's name on it. There are so many examples of that. But
and when you're talking about the beginning period of geometrics only, keep in mind the looms were very likely built by men.
yeah, well, women wouldn't have been doing that.
Women did weave, but the looms were, and I believe it, and I stated that if the guy builds the loom, he knows how to weave. And he knows how to hook up. And
You hope he did anyway, because some of
well-
those early barn looms are
well,
quirky.
we always talk about
they have their
the museum.
challenges. They're all different.
The museum, they teach weaving here to beginners, and usually the teaching is on contemporary looms, modern looms. You have to be an expert before we let you loose on a mule, which is an antique loom.
What are the different sort of business arrangements that some of these professional male figured and fancy weavers and male professional geometric double cloth weavers would have engaged in terms of independent business, partnership, mill partnership, things like that? What can you say about that?
Well, a lot of them, it wasn't unusual to have an apprentice or another weaver living in the house who would be working for you or with you, and various arrangements under that kind of thing. You had people, you mean in terms of marketing?
Sure.
I mean, you know, there's another hotly contested debate over, you know, the so-called crib-size coverlets that you'll see, you know, that might be this big or this big. You know, a lot of folks can call them crib coverlets, but they were also used as samplers. You know, we think about it. They would weave a certain product, and they would. You know, they would be producing a piece like yay big so that somebody could come in and see the quality, witness the quality of your weaving for one thing, get a look at the pattern, and decide. Sometimes, especially if they had a choice of 2 or 3, some of these guys would weave one pattern for their whole career, and others would weave 2 or 3 different patterns, and you would have a choice. In which case, that was pretty sharp. So you would have a chance to take a look at the quality of this guy's weaving and all this kind of stuff, and. Because, you know, if you go back to the point where all this stuff is hand woven, why would you waste all that material just to show somebody? You know, you don't need something that big. So it answers that question too. But you also had some of these weavers who were more ambitious than others, and you didn't necessarily have to go straight to their weaving cabin or whatever to work to see their work. That they would have pieces distributed throughout the geographic area so that you could go to the general store, or you could go down the pike and see something there and place your order and deliver your yarn. Presumably, in many cases, the client would supply the yarn. It would help save money for one thing. Supply the yarn and then go pick it up when it was done. If they, as I say, if these guys were really ambitious, they had several places where you could do that. So that was part of the marketing strategy. But there was a pair of weavers in New York State where he started out, one gentleman started out building looms for the other, and after 3 years was a co-partner. So their coverlets can have either or name on it. That was Ira Hatzel and Van Ness. So there were as many ways of doing this as there were individual weavers. That was the cool part about it, because, you know, these were all individual businessmen. It was a cottage industry, as it were, and so there was many different ways of doing this, as there were people who had the imagination to come up with a way to make it work. That's another thing that makes it interesting.
We know of a German weaver in Somerset County who would weave all winter long. In the spring, he would take 2 horses and drive his wagon to Philadelphia, sell his coverlets he produced throughout the winter, come back 2 weeks, and went to work. Whether the market is at the place, at a pickup point, or he has a market elsewhere, he was just producing coverlets. One of the interesting is that when you look at census lists, you don't see as many weavers because they were listed as farmers.
Why do you think that is?
I don't really know.
So they wouldn't have to pay the tax on the loom.
Well, there are various.
In many cases,
various
that was
reasons,
part of it.
Yeah.
They would list the thing that they made the most money from. So if they were making more income from farming, that was part of it. Sometimes it had to do with paying the tax, paying the local, depending on what your local tax structure was. And it was almost like paying tax on window panes early on when glass was quite rare. They would tax you by the number of window panes you had in your house. So that was probably a consideration.
Do you think there's a social status consideration there as well, in terms of being
conceivably, sure.
being listed as a landowning farmer versus
Yeah.
a craftsperson?
Well,
Maybe.
the fact is that they were farmers. They really were farmers.
In
That
some
was-
cases, yeah.
That was one of the reasons coming to this country, they were able to own land.
Yeah, when you look at the inventories that were done after they passed, some of these guys had extensive land holdings, especially the Germans. They were, as we said before, tended to be a little more ambitious. I hate to paint a group with one brush, but I mean, there were enough cases of that you see that some of these guys, when they passed, and then the amount of money that their estate was worth when they passed was pretty darn impressive for what they did. And some of the Brits were almost nothing. But they had all the same considerations and fears and problems that we all have. I mean, some of them met very sad demises, very sad, and others were very prominent in their communities. And
Can you talk a little bit about some of the more prominent weavers and some of the weavers that became successful industrialists?
wow,
Well, your favorite is
yeah, I
Davidson.
mean, well, yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of Archibald Davidson because that's one of the first figured and fancy coverlets that I ever latched onto. But I particularly love New York State, and of course he's New York State, and he was quite something. I mean, he had a number of people working for him, more than I realized until recently, and he had a few looms, and he had quite an operation going, and he referred to himself. Yeah, I was just going to say he refers to himself. He went through several different corner block trademarks that he used, but in one of them he's talking about himself as the Ithaca Carpet Factory. So clearly he was doing ingrain. He or somebody was doing ingrain carpeting as well, and it breaks my heart that we have no way of looking at ingrain and knowing who made it. I wish they would have signed that too, but alas. That's another interest of ours, and we have several. But so he produced, somewhere along the line, he was producing carpets as well, as a number of these folks did, if you read their advertising. So he's a favorite of mine, and he was pretty successful. He cranked out quite a few coverlets. Harry Tyler is another heartthrob of mine because one of his several trademarks was that hollow lion that is so wonderful. Everybody loves that lion. Musselman in Pennsylvania numbered his coverlets for a while. Didn't for his whole career, but he numbered them for a number of years, and he made over 800 coverlets, close to 1,000 coverlets apparently. That takes stick-to-it. I would go crazy. I think the repetitive nature of that would make me crazy, but he was cranking them out too. And he was creative in the sense that his corner blocks are different from each other too. And one he talks about himself, and in the other way he talks about his client. So he gets everything in there.
Every state, as you look at the bat, obviously we're not talking about geometric coverlets, which were made everywhere, early settlement times. But when you talk about the figure of five, every state has a prima donna. New York really has a number of great weavers. Tyler is the one. There were Davidsons, there were Cunninghams, there were Benjamin June, there were all kinds of fabulous weavers. Pennsylvania, you're talking about Musselman, you're talking about Kump. Ohio,
There are lots of
Pearson.
Pennsylvania people, so you can't go into all of them because you'd be
But
here
every state,
forever.
as you go west, less and less and less. All of a sudden, you get to the end of the line, you get to Iowa, and you know over Stevenson. You don't see other names. There must be.
Well, you have
the
fewer-
interesting names are, for example, Adolf, and the ones who go west and they start out in Ohio and they go to Illinois and they go to and end up in Missouri. Snyder,
Well, I was thinking about Causley and
the current
Stevenson.
one just received the other Missouri, Snyder.
Snyder is, yeah.
Snyder.
Yeah.
But when you go west, it's very hard to.
Well, because there was no population. Obviously, these people would start out somewhere in the east and they would wind up somewhere in the west, and some of them moved around, but that didn't make them itinerant. They would move their whole family because they would either saturate the local market or whatever, and they thought the grass was greener in the next door state. But you know, we have visitors going. We are open, so I have to apologize for the fact that if we're looking around and hearing things, it's because people are very politely walking around this room and going to the next one. So we need to get that in there. But anyway, so yeah, I mean, some of these guys traveled quite a bit, but it wasn't because they were packing their loom up and sticking it on a wagon. It's because they would move to some place where the grass looked a little greener, or where they thought they would have better business or less competition.
When you talk about names, the heartbreak is the fact that the geometric is not identified.
But most quilts aren't either, and it doesn't seem to bother quilt people, so we forgive them.
Yeah, but what's interesting about that is we are receiving coverlets just about daily. The only identifiable geometric coverlet is that comes from a family that is verifiable. It comes down the family, so-and-so wove it, so-and-so. The stories are rich. The true story are very rare.
But it has to be verifiable, and that's the key, because we hear a lot of family stories that seem to be set in stone that are totally inaccurate. But you know, when you really can prove it, it's very exciting.
Do either of you have a favorite style of coverlet or a favorite weaver?
Are we allowed to say this?
Yes,
I don't know. We're going to create more enemies than we will. I personally, I don't know.
I would say so.
I mean, I think Overshot is underrated. I think Overshot is sacred. It's very, very special. If you are fortunate enough to read some of the early books by, Francis Goodrich and Eliza Calvert Hall, they are, they're very special people to me. I'll get I'll messed up if I get too much into it, but I think Overshot is quite special. But if you start getting into the other stuff, I'm partial to double weave. Maybe it's my British background, because it's very interesting when people come in and you can tell by what they relate to. And then you start asking them what their background is, and it carries through in your brain. I don't know why, but it's really true.
Like German
it's really true.
And
but anyway,
Scots like Scottish.
Yeah, it's funny. But I relate to double weave. I love the way the color plays, especially when you're mixing, passing different color. And I like geometric double weaves because one person we know was. And she's absolutely right. It's sad, but she likes to collect those, and she said, I'm sort of a bottom feeder. I like the double weave geometrics, and she wasn't saying it because she believed that, but because other people think of that as less somehow, which I think is a shame, obviously. But double weave, whether it's geometric or figured, I'm kind of partial to that. I fell in love with Archibald Davidson because, as I said, he was probably the first one that I had in my hot little hands as an owner. But I just, people ask us all the time, what's your favorite in the collection? I don't know. I love them all.
My job is easier. Nathaniel Young.
Oh yeah, well that's his heartthrob, yeah.
A Bergen County jersey, double woven blue and white. He wove other colors, but basically the design, the concept is exceptional. In general, I agree with Melinda, double woven.
Well, look at the one behind us. How can you not go crazy over that coverlet?
So it's New York, it's part of New Jersey, and a lot of Indiana. Obviously, we respect it.
Yeah, there's some wonderful Indiana weavers.
I adore Southern coverlets, but as I'm saying, the heartbreak is so hard to pin them down and identify them. But heart and soul is in Appalachia.
Yeah, this one behind us is a double weave. This is Ohio, but it's a fabulous example of what you can do with color, 2 colors of yarn crossing each other. And this is one of my favorites in the collection. But I mean, you know, you'd have to be blind not to agree with that one.
There's a favorite everywhere. Pennsylvania Comp. Musselman's a good weaver. I'm more inspired by Comp.
We could go on for 2 hours about this, and we'll think about afterwards, oh, I should have said him, I should have said him. There are so many really cool ones that it's really hard to, I don't mean to interrupt, but it's really hard to narrow it down.
One in Portsmouth, Ohio.
Yeah, he's cool.
That is phenomenal.
Yeah.
Design matters, you know. Repetition is respectable, it's beautiful, but it's not as punchy as Nathaniel Young. Concept design matters.
So I've got 3 more questions. The first one is about design. What are some of the design sources that these weavers are using? I know that there's still some debate about where the patterns are originating and how they're spreading, but clearly they're using some sort of common design sources. I was wondering if you all had any ideas of what those design sources might be.
Well, the German is easy, be referred to as domestic design, what's around the house. Birds, flowers, obviously. Tulips, obvious.
Well, the potted rose plants and the you know the birds
the grape borders. The birds, the distal thing is a very obvious.
Yeah, that's what I was searching for. I mean, a lot of these are inspired by common folk art.
And we talked about
you see them at
Scots.
Proctor's. You know, German is very easy to do comparisons because you see a lot of these same patterns in Proctor's, and in some cases it's hard to know what inspired what because a lot of the Proctor's are even earlier than the coverlets are. So clearly they're coming from that as a source.
Tell about the
what should I tell about?
Shells.
Oh yeah, it was very interesting to us, and still is, that a lot of the Indiana coverlets appear to have a conch shell or some kind of shell in them, and you know we all know about the Gilmore coverlets that have the sailboat in the corner, and you're thinking they're in Indiana, what? You know, how does that work? And we had a really fabulous. I think it was a Ballantine that he's one of the guys who used some of them would use it as a trademark, and some it's in the field pattern. So, but either way, these shells are appearing in these Indiana coverlets, and we're thinking, okay, fine, all right, whatever. And a gentleman, this is why we talk with our visitors, one of many reasons. And he comes through and he looks at that and he says, oh, that's a certain kind of shell. You see that off the coast of Scotland, and only there. And I said, okay. And I went and I looked it up, and sure enough, it was a main food source. Food, that's important, you know. It was a very popular seashell. I won't remember the name of it, of course, because I don't remember anything these days. But it was a very popular seashell that people sold. You know, she sells seashells by the seashore. I got it out. I said it right. Anyway, it was a very popular seashell that was very. It was common there, but nowhere else. And I've seen several pictures of it that I've done a little research. I haven't had time to get much more thorough about it, but it's a very interesting subject. And this guy just looked at it and said, oh, well, that's what it is, and pointed it out. Cool.
Yeah. So, and you know, it's
there you go.
What your big experience, what big excitement. That's why the sailboat shows up. He came here by sailboat. That's a big piece of memory.
Well, giraffes appeared. Yes, giraffes appeared. We finish each other's sentences half the time. But anyway, giraffes appeared in coverlets not long after the first giraffe appeared in the Paris Zoo, and I thought that was really cool. And that's why I very often refer to these as the T-shirts of the day, because they can have, especially in New York, political slogans and all kinds of stuff. Some of which is a little more subtle than others.
Agricultural.
Well, agriculture and manufacturers are the foundation of our independence. I mean, we can go on about that. There's been papers written about that. I was thinking about the, and now it's going to escape my...
Well, the Masonic symbols.
Well, yeah, the Masonic symbols. There's a series that was done with the busts of the presidents going all around the top, and you can date it by when the latest president was. You know, we've talked about the Olean Canal coverlets. We've talked about the Hempfield Railroad coverlets. I mean, this is obviously being inspired by news of the day.
Yep.
So, yeah, there's a little bit of everything in there.
To me, fascinating, and I can't figure it out. Why does Tyler have snowflakes? Other than
the fact that he's living in New York and it's freezing cold,
you know,
and it looks like snowflakes. They're beautiful, but
there were snowfleks in Pennsylvania.
Well, yeah, but I mean, you know, he's a very interesting study. We do treat this as fine art because they are, but he's a perfect example of why it's important to have more than one coverlet by a certain weaver, especially when that weaver changes his patterns over time. You don't hear of a major museum turning down another Matisse because they already have one, okay? Tyler starts out with very stylized patterns, very quilt-like actually, highly stylized, but he changes some element of his design virtually every year, and he moves slowly and slowly and slowly. He moves more into classic designs, big fruit compotes. The coverlets get bigger and bigger, and the size of the repeat gets bigger. And by the end of his career, he's totally different from what he was doing at the beginning. And if you only ever saw one of his not to mention the fact that he went through 7 different eagle designs in his trademarks because he was a busy guy. But you know, if you only ever saw one of his coverlets, you'd be missing 90% of the story.
The body of work.
Which is another reason why we are determined to have equal time for both figured and fancy and geometric stuff.
Talk to me a little bit about what kind of sources, conferences, coverlet colleges people can attend if they're interested in learning more about coverlets. What are some great primary sources for entry-level folks? What are some more advanced source materials? And where can people go to learn more about coverlets if they're interested?
Well, there are coverlets in every museum and historical society in the country practically. The trick is to find somebody who knows what they have. And that's not always easy. We get inquiries all the time from other museums who want to know what it is that they have. So it takes a bit of luck to hone in on the right place. But there is research. There are books out there, more than some people think. I think the trick is to find the ones that are, in many cases, that are out of print. But there are several reference materials out there. We do catalogs for, and this isn't just going to be a commercial for us, but we do catalogs for every exhibition that we do, and that includes it's not just the label identifying the piece, but it's a little more research, most of which is new research, because we are very well aware of the fact that there needs to be more out there. I mean, the reason why this is a difficult question to answer is that there's never enough. But we are constantly trying to publish, get more information, more pictures, more anything out there. There are a number of places around the country where you can learn to weave. Some are better than others. We offer 1- and 3-day classes for beginners who just want to get a feel for it, but there are several really fine places in this country where you can learn. Redstone Glen, Tom Nisley and his daughter Sarah are world class. If you want to, they're working with contemporary looms, but if you want to learn on old looms and learn concentrating on earlier methods and so on, you can go to the Marshfield School. All of these places you can find online. There is some research that you can find online. It's a little bit harder, but if you're determined, you can find stuff. Some places have programs. There is one up in Clayton, New York every year in May. We do a coverlet college here every year, which is a weekend in September where we offer 2 solid days of presentations and a 3rd day at the beginning on Friday of optional hands-on workshops. More information is available on our website. We're still working on the schedule for this year, but we will hopefully have that available very soon. You can still look at last year's to give you an idea of how it works. I think the big problem with answering that question is there's not enough of it. But a museum that does have coverlets will hopefully have a research library. And if you're lucky, they may let you have access to it. Ours is open for people who want to learn more. But there isn't a single place where you can go to a college in this country and learn traditional weaving. There's much more emphasis on contemporary production weaving, that kind of stuff, all of which is fine, but I would like to see a little more emphasis on the history. So.
We talked about the fact that no information available easily, especially since you don't know what you're looking for. As we earlier mentioned, we got into this by being dealers in the antiques business, realizing that information is needed about coverlets, liking coverlets, presenting them, and talking about the art form. The only place other than this museum we have to refer to is at St. Vincent's. There were two wonderful women, Clorinda Anderson and Kay Hawthorne, who assembled an incredible database for coverlets at the Maryland University, and that database is at
the University of Maryland. Yeah, and that's at St. Vincent's
now. That's at St. Vincent's, which is
that's at the Foster McCarr
available
Gallery.
for studying.
And he was a great collector, so.
And yeah,
there's a museum up in Palmyra, New York, that is worth seeing.
There are major museums. We mentioned this. You can see coverlets various places, but the big concentration, Williamsburg,
yeah,
Winterthur, Ohio, what is it?
It's
Museum of
escaping
Art,
me.
I think, and
Yeah.
the Chicago Art Institute. All these places publish books on the subject that, unfortunately, most of them are out of print, but good source.
And all these places have different levels of accessibility for this stuff. It's not always on display, and you sort of have to know how to find out whether or not you can get into the behind the scenes, if you will, to see some of these things. Because if they're not on display, in some cases you have to know somebody, and that's one of the problems. Because every museum in this country is pressed for resources, and so it's getting harder and harder to gain access to these things because the curators don't have time, or it's not easy for anybody. But there are wonderful resources out there if you can get your hands on them.
This is really the only institution where you come through the door knowing nothing, and we will expose you to coverlets and will try to educate you, telling you what you're seeing.
Yeah, we don't just, empty your wallet of admission money and turn you loose. We really do try to give you an idea of what you're looking at and answer questions and so on. So, and part of the reason why we did it the way we did it and located ourselves the way we are was because we wanted to be centrally located for coverlet production, which is not the middle of the country, not too far north or south for weather reasons, obviously, and economic reasons and everything, but also because we wanted to be open year-round. We wanted to be open 7 days a week, which is insane. But having said that, we know what it's like to be out in the world and traveling through an area and get to some place you really want to see, and that's the day they're closed. And it's just painful when you know that the likelihood of your getting back there is slim to none. So yeah, we've been sitting here at the front lines for 12 years, open every day. But you know what? It's worth it. Because we have met fabulous people, and you never know who's going to arrive on any given day, and it's worth it. But yeah, we really do try to make these available in numbers. That's another thing, because number of places you can go and see one or two. We average 80 to 100, which is still only touching the hem, but there's a moment when it's overwhelming, so you can only do so many at once. But we change these exhibitions periodically. We try to keep it interesting for people. And truly, we do our best to answer a question. If we don't know the answer, we try to find out. what the answer is. Even if it's after they've left, if it piques our curiosity, we're going to go in and figure it out. But as I mentioned before, our board of directors is comprised of fabulous people, including a few people who are fabulous at research. So I have go-to people. If I don't have an answer for a question, I know who to call, and it's a really nice situation to be in.
If I don't have an answer, I make it up.
Yeah, he'll make up an answer, and you'll never know the difference.
It's
We always
more
joke with people.
interesting than the reality.
We do the best we can. We try to have fun with people, but
By the way, we encourage people to take pictures. It's very interesting because I find it bring those people in and tie them to the museum so they are interested in the next one that they don't have a picture of.
yeah, I mean, if it ever gets to the point where where this is like Disneyland and we have 100,000 people coming through here, then obviously flash becomes an issue. But with our current numbers, it's not a problem, and we obviously have lights off in these spaces when there's no one in here. And so we minimize the exposure. I mean, we are aware of all the things that you have to be aware of. But having said that, we rarely try to be visitor friendly. People are astonished that we don't let them handle them, but we don't have barricades either, because as far as I'm concerned, if somebody's really wanting to touch something, it means it's working on them. It means that you are successful in the sense that you're getting a response from somebody. So I'm flattered when somebody says they want to touch something and it's all they can do but I tell them no, if they do that, then he'll hit them with a rubber mallet and we'll have a problem. But
You can't do this at Fort Knox.
but we screw around with people and they have a good time and they remember it for that reason, because anybody who likes coverlets is a friend of ours as far as we're concerned. So that's what it comes down to.
Final question.
Sure.
All right. It's a big one. We've kind of sort of talked about it, but I'm going to ask it directly. What is the importance of the coverlet in the story of America? And the second part of that question is, and what does the coverlet mean to you personally?
Well, I touched on this before when I was talking about the history of textile production in general. I mean, people have been weaving since the Egyptians, and probably before that, if there is such a thing. But textile production is not just about bed covers. It's about all of your household textiles and everything you're wearing and all the rest of it. And most people are all of us who are busy we're not conscious of everything we do about throughout the day. So when people come in here and we make them aware of textiles in general, the fact that we're wearing clothes, it sort of rings a bell with people, and they realize, okay, I guess it is kind of important. And when you think back to the days when everything was made by hand, not just textiles, but furniture and every single thing you touched was made by hand. It wasn't a throwaway society. That phrase comes up all the time. Before cheap jeans and paper towels and disposable diapers and all the things we take for granted, when it was all done by hand and you took special care of it because you knew what went into it, the bedroom and its furnishings, meaning the textiles, were the most valuable things in the house. It does have a lot to do with the foundation of our country, because, as we said before, this newfangled equipment that was invented had a lot to do with immigration into this country and how this country was settled and where, and the fact that Washington was sworn in wearing an American-made suit, and the fact that we were established as colonies not supposed to produce finished goods. It's a big deal. This is not just isn't this pretty kind of thing. This is a really key part of our history, not just as this country is, but as humanity in general. Obviously, we focus on the stuff in this country, but it's a big deal. Why they're important to me, as I said before, it's a lifestyle. We live with antiques. History is a very interesting thing, and we are, as a country, going to be in big trouble if we stop teaching it. But that's another story. History is something you better keep track of, or you will repeat it in some ways that you may not want to do. But there is something about the color and the texture and the design and the fact that it beautifies the whole atmosphere of the space that it's in. And that, coupled with history, I don't know, I consider this place to be really the expression of my life's work anyway. I'm proud to be here. It's required a whole lot of sacrifices on our part, but it's worth it if we can get the message out to a few people that they're cool. They're really neat, and you don't have to know any of this stuff that we've been yammering on about for the last bit. You don't have to know any of it to appreciate how beautiful they are. But if it really starts to work on you and you want to know more, for every minute that you invest in learning more about it, you're going to get more than that back. So they're neat. That's it.
It's an American art form. We are constantly struggling with where else and who else. We know that Welsh design shows up in geometrics. We know the German brings his design sense from Germany. We talked about the thistles. I see a thistle, I know it's a Scottish weaver. But we don't see Scottish coverlets. We know there are blankets in Wales. We know that everybody wove blankets. But the coverlet is an American piece of textile. And that's what's important to us.
I'm glad, because we're in it pretty deep, so I'm glad we both like them.
You are deeper than I am.
We'd be in trouble if one of us didn't like these things, because we do it together.
Well, is there anything else that you all would like to add?
Well, you mentioned something early on before we started this conversation. The big question, very important and pressing question is, what's going to happen afterwards? Very hard to decide how to answer this. The ideal would be to continue this museum as it is, running on the same tracks, acquiring more coverlets. We have an enormous collection.
That are donated.
Consequently donated by the public practically daily. People who go through here see them, they understand this is the place where they are understood, studied, properly stored, interpreted, shown. When we receive a coverlet, we promise that it's going to be on the wall eventually. They take turns. At this point, our numbers suggest that the same one, unless there is a special need or importance to it, will not show up for years because there are so many. Question is, what's going to happen? The desire is to develop someone or some way or form to have somebody who is dedicated to the subject matter, knows the material, and presents it properly in the future. We have a board of directors. They were obviously involved in the making of decisions of the future, but the future is very important. This is an enormous effort, starting with, in my case, over 50 years of antiques business, and the two of us together, 30 years of acquiring them, promoting them, showing them, interpreting them. We would like somebody to continue this with the same interest, same enthusiasm, hopefully more knowledge.
Well, and hopefully somebody who's coming in here not just because it's a job, but
Yes.
somebody who is passionate.
This
because
is not a job. This cannot be.
This has to, hopefully will be somebody who can look at a coverlet and say, hey, I would have killed to have a resource like this a few years back. And so I'm really hoping that eventually you or somebody like you will come in here and somebody for whom this, resounds somehow in your inner workings, and really likes this stuff, because if it's just a job, it's not going to fly. And I would hate to think that that somebody would come in and look at a coverlet that may not be in perfect condition and say, oh, get rid of it because it's not perfect, and not realize, with enough of a background to realize which ones are really important, because they're all important, but which ones are really sacred, and that takes some background. So I hope it will be somebody with some experience and hopefully some passion, because this place was founded out of passion. So I'm hoping that it will continue that way.
I just want to mention one thing. We happen to have a member of this museum who is a dear friend, an old collector in the state of Indiana. He acquired, except for one, every single known Indiana weaver's coverlet.
Examples of every known.
This man can tell you every single coverlet, how he found it, what he paid for it, why did he get it, and I cannot imagine anybody more dedicated to the subject matter than him.
And we need more like that. Yeah.
In other words, the conclusion is, you take it.
It's all yours, kid.
All right. Well, is there anything else that you all would like to
Send us money.
Yeah, we need a winning lottery ticket. Would be yes. You know, early on, somebody sent us. You know, this is just another story of some of the funny stuff that happens when we were first starting here. We started in one room, and we really literally had no money. And she sent us a card afterwards with it was a coupon or something. Yeah, it was a coupon for Mickey D's, so that we could get a decent lunch. And she said, I would like to support the museum. I have no money, but here's a coupon for a hamburger at McDonald's. And you know, that was 12 years ago. I never forgot it. I thought that was really pretty cool. So, you know, all we need is about 500 million of those, and we'll be ready to rock and roll.
All I need is a McDonald's French fries.
Yeah, well, he's a vegetarian, so
No,
that won't work.
French
but never mind.
fries.
French fries, yes, he could live on French fries.
So we can raise the money.
Yeah, right. But anyway.
All right, this has been Matthew Monk interviewing the Zongers here at the National Museum of the American Coverlet for the National Museum of American History's National Woven Coverlet Project.
I can't believe you got that straight.
On
Okay.
Saturday, June 30th, 2018.
Thank you.
We revealed you our underwear.